Hey there, welcome to another episode of Digging In. Today, we're going to be digging into Psalm 2. We're continuing our focus here at Sunny Slope on the Psalms, and the kind of the second part of this whole series is looking at what do the Psalms teach us about the problem of human sinfulness and human brokenness. It's true, of course, that actually just about every psalm will tell you something about that, but there are some psalms that capture quite vividly the effects of evil in this world and evil in our own heart. And Psalm 2 is one of these psalms. I'm going to put it up on the screen for us. And as always, our first job when we want to study a text, I think it's good to prayerfully read through the psalm at least once or twice. And you're not doing any in-depth study at that point. You're not doing any, textual analysis. You're reading it through. And I think there's three questions to be asking as you're doing that. Three, maybe just to jot down or have in the back of your mind. The first is, what does this text tell us about what's wrong with either us or the world? What does this show us about human sinfulness? How does God provide the solution? And then what should we do as a response? So I always like to ask those questions and jot a few thoughts down in my notes as I read through. Then we get to this next phase, and this is the part of the study where what we're really interested in doing is trying to break the text down into phrases one at a time so that we can follow the order of thought and the logic, and we can begin to kind of lay out the way that the psalm is meant to be heard. So we start off, Psalm 2 begins with a question, and it's a question that has parallelism, sort of two questions asked the same way, or same question asked two ways. Why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? And I always like to do, when it's parallelism, I like to just line them up just like that. Um, so rage, plot in vain. Again, it's the same question. Hebrew parallelism is huge, and it's always, you got to learn to kind of spot that. It's not too difficult usually to see. The kings of the earth set themselves, and again, kings of the earth and rulers, parallel idea. The rulers take counsel together. I like to line it up like that, against the Lord and against his anointed. So you kind of see the way the parallelism unfolds. Kings of the earth, rulers against the Lord, against his anointed. Excuse me. Saying, it always gets a little tricky. I tend to run out of room, so I'm going to make my margins just a little bit bigger here. Maybe that'll buy us some space. Saying, this is what they're saying, let us burst their bonds apart, and I think burst and cast away their cords from us. He who sits in the heavens, laughs. And then again, it's another parallel phrase because he who sits in the heavens, and the second phrase that answers that, the Lord holds them in derision. We're going to line up. I'm going to just kind of phrase it out like this. So I can see that the Lord is he who sits in the heavens, holds them in derision, and laughs in derision, I think kind of line up. Then he will speak to them in his wrath and terrify them in his fury. And we'll just kind of line this up like that. Saying, now we notice that actually, and we'll pay more attention to this in the next part of our study, but you'll notice there's kind of a bigger parallel idea here. Here we have the kings of the earth and the rulers saying, let us burst their bonds and cast their cords. So they're speaking, and now God is speaking. So there's kind of you see what, first we look at what the nations are saying, then we look at what God says. As for me, I have set my king on Zion, my holy hill. I will tell of the decree. And then what is the decree? Well, the Lord said to me, you are my son. I have begotten you. This, as far as I can understand, this includes this part here is the decree. This is what God says. Now, we have a question here. Who is God saying this to? The Lord said to me, "You are my son." Who says that? Who is speaking that? And our answer right now is, well, we don't know yet. We'll have to wonder about that. Um, we have some theories maybe and some ideas in our mind. If you've studied this text or if you're familiar, maybe have some sense of it. But for now, we're kind of asking that question, who is God saying this to? Ask of me, I will make the nations your heritage. And then again, another parallel phrase, the ends of the earth, your possession. And it finally happened. We ran out of room. You shall break them with the rod of iron, dash them in pieces like a potter's vessel. So there's the decree. That's what God says to his anointed. And then this last part then is a therefore clause, which means here's what logically follows next. Now therefore, O kings, be wise and be warned, O rulers of the earth. So kind of we call that actually a chiasm. King, it's not really a chiasm, but kind of. Kings be warned, kings be wise, be warned, O rulers of the earth. So you could sort of, if you really want to see what I mean, you can do this. A chiasm is again, this really isn't the best example of one, but if you're interested, a chiasm is where you get a series of ideas that all kind of line up, and then the first and the last are parallel, and then the ones in the middle are parallel. So you'd call this A, B, um, actually we do it like this. If we really want to follow it exactly, then you can kind of see. O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers. So it kind of follows that parallel. Sometimes you see that a lot of times when you find a chiasm in Hebrew poetry, or sometimes even in the New Testament, the ideas are a lot more developed and it's a lot more profound. But this is just maybe I just thought I'd point that out for fun. It's called a chiasm, by the way. Chiasm after the Greek letter chi, which is kind of equivalent to our letter X. And so you kind of have, half of an X shape here. Anyways, fun fact for the day. But here's the command: serve the Lord with fear, rejoice with trembling, kiss the Son, lest he be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. Blessed are those who take refuge in him. Um, there you have it. That's Psalm 2. There's some language in here uh, connecting us to Psalm 1, which we'll get to a little bit later. Lots of stuff going on in this text. To me, it's a fascinating text. Speaks a lot about how do we make sense of the world around us when there's all this, chaos and confusion. But we'll get into all that. So the next part of our text, what we're going to do is we're going to analyze it in more depth. We're going to pay more attention to the individual words, to the grammar, to the background of the text, whatever we can learn of it, and that's going to help us understand the message and the meaning of the text. So we'll pick it up here shortly. Welcome back to our study of Psalm 2. We are digging into this psalm. We've already spent some time looking at the outline of the text and how the thoughts and the ideas of the text are all organized and arranged kind of in logical order. That's always the first step in doing a good study. You want to be able to identify how the thought and the flow of the text goes. Our next step here, as I pull the text back up for us, our next step is to pay attention to the language and the way that the author uses words and imagery to communicate his overall point. Now, we're going to start with this. The other thing that we also want to pay attention to is who is speaking to whom and about whom. That's always a really important question. And I say that because we start off here, the psalmist is asking a question, why do the nations rage and the peoples plot in vain? Now, this is classic Hebrew poetry. It really is a way, this first line is a way of saying the same thing in two different ways. Nations and peoples become synonymous, and raging and plotting in vain is also a way of saying the same thing in two slightly different ways. And in Hebrew poetry, when you see that, it's really just a way to drive the point home. And the point is that the nations are in uproar. And so we can start, that's kind of a thematic sentence. The nations are in uproar, and the psalmist asks, why is it that way? Um, Now this is a really good entry point because right off the bat we're confronted with a question that we've all wondered about at times, right? When we look around the world, we don't see a world that exists in, perfect harmony and shalom and peace the way really it ought to be. We actually see war and we see conflict. We see nations coming to power and overthrowing others. And so there's all this. And so we ask that very same question, why are things the way that they are? And if we aren't quite sure what the psalmist is talking about when he talks about rage and plotting in vain, he goes on in the next sentence and he continues to speak about this. He continues to elaborate on this. Now, I'm going to draw your attention to at least one word that shows up a number of times. I'm going to use the color purple. It seems appropriate because he's talking about the kings of the earth. And we actually know a little bit later he repeats that. And there's one more time further on that we'll come to in a little bit. Same thing, by the way, for the word earth. That shows up at least a couple times. I always use colors that hopefully I can kind of remember on. So earth is green. And then rulers, I don't know, let's use kind of a fuchsia that's kind of tied to purple. Rulers shows up here. And then a little bit later on down near the end of the psalm. We're not there yet, but we'll get there. Now, that's important because it begins to help us understand this question here, the question of the nations. This is really a question of authority. It's a question of who really is in charge, who's really the authority in this world. Because we have all these examples. We have kings, we have rulers, we have nations, we have peoples, and they're all in uproar. And so the question is, who is in charge? That's really just one way to put this. And because what the psalmist is noticing is that whoever's in charge is maybe not doing such a good job of running things, at least in one human sense, because there's all this chaos and there's all this conflict and tension in this world. You'll notice that the psalmist begins to answer his question already. Whoops. I'm going to just use the word. I'm going to use it as a highlighter. Well, we're going to highlight the word the Lord. That shows up several times in this text here. We see it down here, the Lord. And it again is another one down here, another occurrence down there. But there's there's this question that you begin to see, or this issue that you begin to see, which is that the kings and the rulers of this world are against, and that shows up at least twice there, against the Lord. So the conflict, as we begin to understand it now, is not so much just an international, like an internation conflict. It's not just between one nation and another, but it's actually a conflict between the nations and the authorities of this world, and ultimately against Yahweh and his anointed. Um, so the psalmist here is in this first part of the psalm, what he's writing about in this whole first part is the psalmist is speaking about the nations. We'll just write that here. He's not he's not necessarily speaking to them, but he's speaking about them. And we'll just say about the nations. The psalmist is speaking about the nations here in these first two verses. Now, oh, I forgot. There's the word Lord again. I forgot to. I better highlight that again, because that shows up now in this next part here, the Lord, and because that marks a transition point. This actually helps us see that there's a change in this part. I think going down about here, all of this is now it's actually Yahweh or the Lord about the nations. So there's a parallel there. If the first part of the text, running out of room there, if the first part of the text here is about the psalmist questioning the nations and making his observations about the nations. Now we read, how does the Lord view this, or how does the Lord say this? Now, it's true that the mostly the Yahweh is not speaking here, but the psalmist is speaking about Yahweh and about what the Lord is saying. And what is it that we learn? Well, we learn from God's vantage point, things look very different. If from the human vantage point, rulers and nations are taking their stand, from God's vantage point, he's laughing and holding them in derision. That's simply a way of saying that from God's vantage point, the claims of authority that are made by the nations and the rulers of this world, they sound rather absurd to God. Because the Lord laughs. And then now there's a parallel here because you see, can highlight. Oh, I'm running out of highlighting colors, but over here we read that the nations of the world are saying something. Down here, now it's God's turn to speak. So we see again that same phrase repeated. Um, in a sense, you could probably argue that there's parallelism here. The nations are questioned about their actions, and the Lord responds to their actions. The nations speak about their actions, and then God speaks about his actions. And actually, we see at least twice. There's at least two things. He will speak to them in his wrath, terrify them, and then there's a second time down here that he's speaking. Um, and so we get the content of the speech is a little bit later on. It's right about here. And we begin to find out what is it that God is saying. Well, it's God has actually established his king. So the kings of the earth have to pay attention because we see the psalmist wants to make it clear that God has his own king that he has established, and his king is established in Zion. And then the psalmist actually expands on that here. We're going to actually draw some attention to another word here. We'll highlight it because it says, "You are my son." And this is then what God says to his son. It's a little bit of questioning here because it says, "The Lord says to me," and who is that me? Who are we talking about? Well, we'll figure that out a little bit later on. I happen to have some understanding of that, but if you read it for the first time through, it's not exactly clear. And who's the I? Who's the speaker here? Who's the me? Well, we actually can draw a pretty good conclusion based on the fact that this is God speaking. I've established my king on my holy hill. So that's God has put his king, and then God continues to speak. I will tell of the decree, and then the Lord said to me, "Here's what God says." We have kind of all this down here. Um, and by the way, there's the word nations again. We can highlight that, and that kind of is important because if the word nations shows up here at the beginning, then it also you see it shows up again down here, I guess parallel to the idea of earth. But you begin to see the contrast that's intended. The same language is used here, and then it's used down here, and that's really meant to help us see that the nations and the rulers of this world say one thing, but God is really saying another. And that sets up this contrast or this conflict between the nations and rulers of this world and the claims of authority that God makes. And the question is ultimately who's in control of the nations of this world? That's really what this all boils down to. All right, we've done all this wonderful, wonderful work, and we're going to actually just have to clear it all away because we're going to scroll down a little bit. We're going to look at the conclusion of the psalm because what the psalmist does after he lays out this claim of authority all up here, all of this is naming what it is that God says about the nations or about his king and the nations. And we see again, we're going to highlight, I'm just going to re-highlight a couple things just so that just to emphasize them. God's king, because we see down here, we see the idea of kings as well. We want to come back and highlight the word. Let's use this word here. Um, uh, well, rulers is up near the top. Let's do the idea of son. You are my son, and therefore kiss the son. So again, there's this parallel. What are we to do with this information? One more, I guess. Um, the ends of the earth and the rulers of the earth. Rulers is another word. I think I mentioned that already. I'm gonna highlight it here, and I'm just gonna remind us that we already dealt with that word up there. Um, and then I think there was, yeah, oh, there was one word that yeah, we actually just barely can see it here. It's the word. We'll use orange. That seems appropriate for wrath, and then wrath down here. So what you can see, I think what the psalmist is doing, and I think it begins to stand out, is this is what the claim that God makes about his king. This is God's response to the claims of earthly authority. And God is essentially saying, "Hey, I've already, oh, I know there's, yeah, there's a word I forgot. I did want to highlight that. It's the word Lord. We see it up here and we see it down here as well. And that is important because this whole first part of the text is all about God's response to the claims of human and earthly authority. And the way that the psalmist concludes is by telling us how then should the kings of this earth respond. If God really is sovereign, what does that mean? He says, "Be wise and be warned." So this is kind of like, "Now therefore, O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers." There's kind of a chiasm here again. A, B, B prime, A prime. It's just what you see this idea here, and then these two ideas are kind of parallel. So sometimes you see that, "O kings, be wise, be warned, O rulers." Just a way of kind of emphasizing, and then in the middle here, this is meant to stand out. This is like the main point. The psalmist is calling for the attention of the people who claim to have authority. Now, he's not denouncing their authority, but he's calling them to put their authority in the proper place. He's calling them to submit their authority ultimately to the Lord with fear and trembling, lest he, meaning God, right, Yahweh, the Lord, be angry and you perish in the way, for his wrath is quickly kindled. This line probably should belong on its own line, but in any case. Now the psalmist ends with this line, "Blessed are all who take refuge in him." Now, I'm going to just hint at something here. Psalm 1, verse 1 is the previous psalm. Most people agree that that's an introduction psalm to the whole book of the Psalms. The first line in the Psalms is blessed. Now, the interesting thing is many people think that Psalm 2 is also the second part of an introduction. If Psalm 1 talks on an individual level, Psalm 2 talks about the nations, and it ends the introduction. If that's true, then Psalm 1 and 2 both are two introductory psalms, and they begin and end with the same word, with the word blessed, and that seems to be a good possibility. That seems to be one way to look at this. In that case, where the first psalm teaches us about happiness as we find it individually in obedience and submission to God. The second says happiness is what happens when the nations are in proper relationship to God. So we can explore that theme more, but you get a sense for how this is kind of all coming together. Now, we've kind of dug a little bit deeper. We've looked at the basic theme here, which has to do with the claims of authority that are made by the nations and the rulers of this world over against the claims that God makes to be sovereign over all the nations and what he has done to assert that authority over the nations. We have more to do. We're going to keep digging in, but I hope you'll join me on March 30th when we have the chance to look into this psalm in greater detail and hear a message. Thanks for watching.